I'm Elizabeth, Liz to friends, and I've been handling books at my dad's business since I graduated. We're in sports gear, anything a gym could need, we supply. It's a family gig, Dad started it, and I kind of fell into it after school. I never minded the numbers or the routine. It paid well, kept me close to family, and honestly, wasn't too taxing. The night I met Tom was at our annual company party. It was one of those evenings filled with too much cheap wine and those little sandwiches everyone pretends to like. I was stuck near the buffet, debating if I should try the dodgy-looking shrimp, when he walked over, plate in hand, that easy smile playing on his lips. "Trust me, the shrimp's a gamble, but the mini quiches? Solid choice," he said, nudging the plate a bit towards me as he took one himself. I laughed, taking his advice. "Thanks, I'm Liz, by the way." "Tom. I work at the branch across town. Heard a lot about you, the boss's daughter and all." "Hopefully, all good things," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. We moved away from the food, finding quieter spots to chat through the night. Tom was easy to talk to, a bit too smooth maybe, but it was refreshing. His humor was a mix of sarcasm and wit, and he had an answer for everything. We talked more about everything, music, movies, places we'd traveled. He had a way of making the evening fly by, and when he suggested grabbing coffee later in the week, I didn't hesitate. We should do this again, without the stale sandwiches and forced mingling. There's a great little cafe downtown, quiet, good for talking. Sounds good to me, I agreed, and we exchanged numbers. As I watched him mingle with others, Dad came over, a look of approval on his face. "Tom's a good man, sharp. Keeps things running smoothly over at his branch." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and plans. As I left the party, I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe even excited. Little did I know, that night was the start of everything, good and bad. That first meeting at the cafe wasn't supposed to turn into anything big. Just coffee, maybe a pastry, and a bit of chat outside the noisy backdrop of the corporate party. But it turned into dinner, and not long after, it turned into a life together. We got married, surrounded by family and friends who seemed just as swept up in our whirlwind romance as we were. My parents loved Tom from the start. Dad even made him his deputy, and later bumped him up to head of the company. Everything seemed like it was falling into place perfectly. After the wedding, I shifted to working from home. I managed the accounts from our kitchen table, surrounded by piles of papers and the hum of the daily grind. We thought about having kids too, dreamed about it really, but life threw us a curveball. Medical reasons, the doctors said, made it a tough bet. It was a hard pill to swallow, but Tom never seemed fazed by it. He just kept on, business as usual. 9 years. It sounds like a lot when you say it out loud. 9 years of marriage can smooth out any sharp edges, or so I thought. Things with Tom had shifted, like slow-moving tectonic plates, until one day you realize there's a chasm between you. Lately, Tom had been coming home late, the scent of cologne clinging to him like a new shadow. He'd brush past me in the hallway, his face buried in his phone, fingers tapping away messages I wasn't meant to see. "Who's that keeping you so busy?" I'd ask, trying to keep my tone light, casual. "Just work stuff, you know how it is. New contracts, demanding clients." He'd reply without looking up. I nodded, pretending to believe him. But the seed of doubt was planted, watered by his growing indifference. The balance at home had shifted too. I was juggling the accounts from home, handling the chores, trying to keep everything running like a well-oiled machine. But even machines break down. One evening, I was elbow-deep in dish soap when Tom walked in. He glanced at the sink, then at me, and shook his head. "You should wear gloves, Liz. Your hands are starting to look rough," he said, his voice flat. I turned off the tap, drying my hands on a towel. "Maybe you could help out now and then, you know? It's not just my job to clean up." Tom snorted, a short, harsh sound. "I'm busting my ass at work so we can afford not to worry about money, and you want me to come home and do dishes?" "It's called helping, Tom. It's what people who live together do for each other," I shot back, my patience fraying at the edges. He rolled his eyes, dismissing the conversation with a wave of his hand as he headed toward the living room. "I don't have time for this, Liz." That was his new favorite phrase. "I don't have time." It echoed in the empty spaces of our conversations, filling them with silences that were too loud to ignore. One night, as I was folding laundry, I tried again. "We could get someone to help around the house." "It's not about the money, you said it yourself." Tom looked up from his laptop, irritation creasing his forehead. "And I told you before, I don't want strangers in our house. We're not having this discussion again." "It's like you don't even see how tired I am," I said, the words heavier than the bedspread I was trying to straighten. He closed his laptop with a snap. "You're tired? Really, Liz? You sit at home all day, and you're tired?" And just like that, he was out the door, the sound of it closing behind him like a period at the end of a long, run-on sentence. Between the never-ending laundry, cooking, and cleaning, finding time for myself had become a luxury I couldn't afford. My appearance? It took a back seat, something Tom didn't fail to notice, or criticize. "You really should try to keep up a bit, Liz," he'd say, flipping through channels, pausing on images of polished actresses and pop stars who were my age or older. "Look at them, they manage to look good. What's your excuse?" I sighed, tired of the same old argument. "Tom, those women have teams, stylists, makeup artists, probably a plastic surgeon on speed dial. It's not a fair comparison." He scoffed, unimpressed. "Excuses, Liz. They take care of themselves. That's the difference." His words stung, and what hurt more was the cold, calculating way he'd look at me sometimes. Those looks carried no warmth, no love, just a harsh assessment, as if he was tallying my flaws like I was another line in one of my spreadsheets. As weeks slid into months, the vibe between Tom and me grew colder than a winter draft. He was home less, and when he was, it felt like he was miles away. I'd catch him lost in thought, his phone always buzzing silently beside him. Sometimes, he'd snap it up so fast you'd think it was about to explode. "Late night?" I called out to his retreating back one evening as he came in later than usual. He paused, shoulders tense. "Yeah, had to smooth over some client issues. You know how it is." I nodded, though he wasn't looking to see it. Something in his tone didn't sit right with me. His words were too rehearsed, like he had been practicing them all the way home. A few days later, he slipped up. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was showering. I stared at it, debating. It wasn't right to snoop, but the gnawing doubt wouldn't leave me be. As I stood there, the screen lit up again, a message preview flashing briefly. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, kiss, Jess." My heart sank to my feet. Who was Jess? His finger moved so quick to lock the phone when he saw me near it before. I didn't know what to do, torn between confronting him and finding out more on my own. I made a decision then, one I never thought I'd make. I contacted a detective. It felt sneaky, underhanded, but I needed the truth more than I needed to feel noble about how I got it. "Look, I just want to know what's going on. I think my husband's seeing someone else," I whispered over the phone, feeling like a traitor. The detective was all business. "We can handle this discreetly. You'll have answers within a week." I hung up, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Knowing was better than wondering, right? For the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious wife. Tom's late nights continued, his excuses more flimsy. I smiled, nodded, and waited. The detective's call couldn't come soon enough. The day that changed my whole life started with a tornado. The air was thick with tension and the ominous buzz of an incoming storm. I heard the tornado sirens in the distance, a wailing reminder that nature was about to unleash its fury. Tom had been on edge all morning, pacing and frequently checking his phone, which was odd given the severity of the weather forecast. "Hey, Liz, can you do me a favor? The weather radio is in the barn. I need you to grab it so we can keep track of the storm," Tom said, his voice carrying a sharpness that felt like a command more than a request. I grabbed my jacket, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The wind was picking up, howling around the corners of the house as I made my way to the barn. The sky was a bruised mix of gray and black, swirling ominously. As I entered the barn, the musty smell of old hay and machine oil hit me. I flicked on the light and started searching for the radio, but something felt off. The barn was too quiet, the usual creaks and groans of the old structure eerily absent over the roar of the wind outside. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Tom," I yelled, banging on the wood. "This isn't funny. Let me out." Through the thin crack under the door, I saw his shadow. He was standing there, not moving, not helping. "Liz, listen." His voice was cold, emotionless. "I locked you in. A very powerful tornado is coming. It will hit here, and when it does, the barn will go first." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about? Why would you do this?" "It's simple, really. You die in the tornado, it looks like an accident. I inherit everything, and I'm free," he said, each word slicing through the howling wind like a knife. I pounded on the door with both fists, disbelief and fear mingling with each sharp thud. "You can't do this, Tom. Open the door." But his footsteps receded, the crunch of gravel under his boots growing fainter until there was nothing but the storm's roar left to answer me. Panic clawed at my throat as I scrambled around the barn, looking for anything to break the door or signal for help. The realization that Tom had planned this, had wanted me gone, was a betrayal that burned hotter than my fear. Then, as the barn began to shudder with the first violent gusts, I heard another sound, barking. Mr. Jenkins' dog, a scrappy little beagle named Bandit, was outside, his barks punctuated by frantic whines. "Here. I'm in here, Bandit," I screamed, hoping his owner wasn't too far behind. Moments later, the door burst open, and there was Mr. Jenkins, wide-eyed, with Bandit tugging at his heels. "Liz." Thank God, I heard Bandit barking and knew something was wrong. He shouted over the wind, grabbing my arm and pulling me out into the storm. We ran together, heading for his house, the tornado sirens wail a grim soundtrack to our escape. As we reached his house, I dared to look back. The barn was already disappearing into the swirling debris, a casualty of the storm and of Tom's cruel plot. After Mr. Jenkins pulled me from the remains of the barn, he led me down into the dimly lit basement, where the sound of the tornado seemed a little more distant. He handed me a steaming cup of coffee and tuned the weather radio to the latest updates. The broadcasters were calling it a surprisingly powerful storm, one that hadn't been anticipated to hit with such ferocity. As I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, Mr. Jenkins settled across from me, his eyes filled with concern. "Liz, what in the world happened out there? Why was Bandit barking at the barn?" I took a deep breath, my voice shaky as I started to explain. "Tom, he locked me in there. On purpose. Said it was so the tornado would take care of me." Mr. Jenkins' eyebrows shot up, his weathered face crinkling in shock. "He did what now? That can't be right, Liz." "It's true," I insisted, the reality of it making my voice firmer. "He told me himself. Said after the tornado, he'd be free to do as he pleased." The old man shook his head, disbelief etched into every line on his face. "That's cold, Liz. Real cold. And stupid. Did he really think he'd get away with it?" I shrugged, the absurdity of the situation not lost on me, despite the terror it had inspired. "I guess he thought the storm would cover everything up. Make it look like an accident." Shock painted Mr. Jenkins' features, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "We need to call the police, now." He fished his phone from his pocket, tapping and swiping, but his face fell. "No signal. Damn storm's knocked out everything. We'll have to wait it out." I nodded, the reality of the situation sinking in. Outside, the wind howled like a beast at the gates, angry and relentless. Inside, the storm of betrayal and deceit was just as chaotic in my mind. Mr. Jenkins noticed my distant look and put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "We've got a few hours before this lets up and we can get a call out. Then we'll get the police, and they'll take care of Tom. He won't get away with this." His words were meant to comfort, but a faint smile was all I could muster. How had I lived all these years alongside a man capable of such cold-blooded calculation? The man I had shared meals with, laughed with, and trusted with my life, planning my end so he could start anew. The hours ticked by, marked by the steady drip of a leak somewhere in the corner of the cellar and the relentless battering of the storm against the little house. Mr. Jenkins made us more coffee, and we sat mostly in silence, listening to the crackle of the radio and the distant booms of thunder. When Mr. Jenkins and I finally emerged from the storm cellar, the world looked like it had been turned inside out. Trees were down, houses were damaged, and my heart was heavy as we walked towards what remained of my home. As we approached, I saw a crowd gathered, neighbors, emergency responders, and there, in the midst of them all, was Tom. He was putting on quite a show, sobbing and clutching one of my concerned neighbors, as if he was the bereaved. Seeing him like that, playing the part of the devastated husband, ignited something fierce within me. I strode forward, my steps firm, despite the soft, mud-slicked ground. "Liz." Tom's act dropped as his eyes met mine. His face went white, his fake tears drying up instantaneously. The crowd turned, a collective gasp rising as they saw me, very much alive. I didn't break stride, walking right up to him, feeling every eye on us. "What's the matter, Tom? You look like you've seen a ghost," I said, my voice loud and clear, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Tom stuttered, his usual smooth demeanor crumbling. "Liz, I thought you were." He couldn't finish his sentence, his gaze darting around, looking for any kind of sympathy or support from our neighbors. "I was in the barn, Tom. Locked in. Just like you planned, right?" I pushed on, not giving him room to wriggle out of the truth. He shook his head, a pathetic attempt at denial. No, that's not, it was an accident. Locked from the outside, Tom. Mr. Jenkins found me. He saved my life." I turned to gesture at Mr. Jenkins, who nodded, stepping forward to support my claims. "It's true," Mr. Jenkins chimed in. "Found her locked tight in that barn, just before it was destroyed. Had to break her out." The crowd's murmur turned into an uproar. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger towards Tom. Seeing the doubt in their eyes, I pulled out my phone. The detective had come through last night, just before the storm. I had proof now, pictures and messages between Tom and his mistress. "And if you're looking for a motive," I said, swiping through my phone to pull up the damning evidence, "here it is." I held up the screen for Tom, and for anyone else who was close enough to see. Pictures of Tom with another woman, cozy and smiling in a way he hadn't with me in months. Tom's face went from white to red, anger replacing his fear. "You had me followed? You invaded my privacy? That's your takeaway here?" I was incredulous, almost laughing at his audacity. "Not that you tried to kill your wife." A police officer, who had been called to the scene by a neighbor, finally stepped forward. He'd heard enough and seen the photos I'd shown. "Mr. Walters, I'm going to need you to come with me." After the police car drove off, the tension seemed to drain out of the crowd. Neighbors approached, offering hugs, expressions of shock and support. My parents came through the crowd, my mom in tears, my dad with an arm around her shoulders, both of them engulfing me in a tight embrace. "We thought we'd lost you," Mom whispered, holding me close. "I'm okay, Mom," I assured her, squeezing her back. "I'm okay." The day moved on, and the crowd eventually dispersed. I stood there with Mr. Jenkins and my parents, looking at the damage, at the debris that was once my barn, at the life I had almost lost. In the weeks that followed, my life became a whirlwind, not of debris and storm winds, but of legal papers, meetings, and the hard, unyielding benches of courtrooms. Tom's trial was fast-tracked given the nature of his crime, and every time I sat in that courtroom, I saw a man I no longer recognized. He looked smaller somehow, caged in by his own misdeeds. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to head to court, my dad stopped by. He had been my rock through this ordeal, never faltering in his support. "Liz, you ready for this today?" he asked, his voice steady, but his concern evident in his eyes. I nodded, adjusting the scarf around my neck. I have to be, Dad. It's not just for me. It's to show him he can't just get away with it. The courtroom was packed, a silent testament to the gravity of the case. As the prosecutor laid out Tom's intentions and actions, the air seemed to thicken with each word spoken. When it was my turn to testify, I stood, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Tom wouldn't meet my eyes as I recounted what happened, his lawyer scribbling notes furiously as I spoke. The hardest part was reliving the fear, voicing it out loud in a room so quiet you could hear a pin drop. After I spoke, the defense did their best to muddy the waters, suggesting misunderstanding, desperation, but the evidence was irrefutable. The judge's gavel was a sound of finality when it came down. Guilty of attempted murder, the judge declared, his voice resolute and clear. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, a cacophony of relief and disbelief. As the bailiffs took Tom away, his glance finally met mine. There was a plea there, maybe for forgiveness, for some sliver of the past to hold on to. The aftermath of the trial was a quieter sort of storm. Dad had removed Tom from the company the day after my rescue, and his position was still vacant, the office untouched. You know, Liz, Dad said one evening as we were closing up the office together. We should start looking for someone to fill Tom's position. The company needs leadership. I paused, considering. Maybe that leader could be me, I suggested, the idea forming fully for the first time. Dad looked at me, surprise etched across his features, then his face softened into a smile. I think that's a fantastic idea. You've been the backbone of this place for more years than anyone else. Life started to settle into a new normal. I was busier than ever with the company and rebuilding my life piece by piece. The community's support was overwhelming, with neighbors and friends constantly checking in or dropping by with food, flowers, and words of encouragement. After Tom's conviction, the divorce was quick and to the point. There wasn't much to discuss. The court granted me all his properties on the grounds of his deceit and the severe nature of his betrayal. A few months into navigating my new life as the head of the company and rebuilding from the emotional rubble, I got an unexpected call. It was Tom's lawyer, sounding overly formal and slightly uncomfortable. Ms. Walters, Tom would like to meet with you. He's requested a visit at the prison, he relayed. I paused, the past and its shadows briefly clouding my day. Did he say why? He mentioned needing to apologize, to make amends for his actions. The lawyer continued, his voice carefully neutral. I took a deep breath, the memory swirling, bitter and sharp. Tell him I'll think about it. A week later, I stood outside the prison, the building stark and uninviting. Inside, I was led through a series of security checks, before being shown to a small, stark room with chairs on either side of a glass partition. Tom was already there, looking older, the weight of his guilt etched into his features. He picked up the phone on his side as soon as I sat down. Liz, thank you for coming, he started, his voice shaky. I picked up the receiver, my grip firm. Let's skip the pleasantries, Tom. What do you want? Tom swallowed, his eyes not meeting mine. I'm sorry, Liz. For everything. I was hoping, maybe you could find it in you to forgive me, to speak on my behalf for a pardon. Tom, you tried to kill me. You planned it so you could be with someone else, while keeping everything we built together. You're not asking for forgiveness, you're asking for a favor because you're still trying to take the easy way out, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I know it's a lot to ask, but... I cut him off, needing to finish this on my own terms. No, Tom. I came here for closure, not to offer you absolution. You need to serve your time, just like I had to endure the pain and the fear you caused. Tom's face crumpled, and he finally looked at me, really looked at me. There was desperation there, but behind it, I saw the realization that I was no longer the woman he thought he could manipulate. I can't help you, Tom. I won't, I said firmly, setting down the receiver with a finality that felt like the closing of a heavy door. I walked out of that prison, feeling lighter than I had in years. It was over. I was free, not just from Tom, but from the hold the past had on me.